Sasha, thank you so much for coming in today and sitting down with me. We have a very exciting relaunch of Spycast featuring you as our new host. So thank you so much for coming and for the opportunity to tell me a little bit more about yourself. I think it'll be fun for the listeners to learn about you.
Well, I'm glad to be sitting here with you, Erin,
Yeah.
and to get started together in the days ahead.
Yeah. We've been working together now for a couple of months, which is crazy. It's gone by very fast. So I feel like I, have gotten to know you, but the listeners have not gotten the same opportunity. So we wanted to sit down and give them a little bit about your background, introduce them to you, sort of learn about you and where you come from. So my first question is, this isn't your first rodeo covering spy stories. Tell me a little bit about your background. Tell me a little bit about how you started covering spy stories, what makes you interested in it, kind of what makes you tick in this world.
Well, I have to say that a lot of people think that this beat, intelligence reporting, is very intriguing, and I certainly have some fascinating stories. And I mean, let's just put aside the fact that I texted the Taliban in Doha, or that on the occasional Friday night I would get a call from the NSA or the CIA. I
How'd you have the Taliban's number?
I cannot reveal sources or methods here.
I probably don't want to know. So,
But I've also walked into a secret Chinese police station hidden above a ramen shop in New York City that had just days before it turned out been busted by the FBI. I interviewed people who had been harassed by Chinese agents in New York. Just a couple months ago, I was standing outside of a residence in the really ritzy neighborhood of Kalorama here in Washington, D.C. And it's a building where Chinese embassy staff live, including China's spies. In the summertime, I went to Ukraine at a point where Ukraine was sort of falling from the headlines, but it was actually a very pivotal moment because the presidential debate had just happened, the NATO summit was about to be started, and Putin went after Ukraine really hard. A missile hit a children's hospital in Kyiv. I went there a few minutes after it happened and saw an absolutely heartbreaking scene, interviewed a woman who had been pulled out of the rubble, talked to people who participated in secret military training, police officers who were going to be sent to the front, covered some of Ukraine's spy games. One time I brought a Russian defector into my media outlet. We silhouetted him, we obscured his voice, and this was for his security. But he told us about a unit inside the FSB, Russia's domestic security service, and it's a unit called DKRO-1 that goes after Americans in Russia, that targets, threatens, harasses Americans. I've done other reporting on how Russian so-called diplomats, but really spies, who were expelled from Poland, were trying to blackmail Ukrainian refugees who had fled the war back in the early days of the war. So there's all of these intriguing stories. You really get to see a very unique side of society.
Yeah.
And my work really came about in a very unexpected way. I was an aspiring journalist, but I couldn't find stability. And so I ended up taking a job at the US State Department, where I was put on a really small team tasked with countering Russian disinformation after Russia illegally seized the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine. And suddenly I was just immersed in this world that I knew very little about. And I found it fascinating. It totally changed what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And it informed the fact that then I would want to go and be a national security journalist. And then, of course, within the national security beat, there's all the different segments.
Right.
And intelligence is really, it's where it's at.
What are some of the places that you've worked in the past, some of the places that you've reported for?
Yeah, well, I feel like I've gone around the block here in Washington. I spent some time in the last few years at Scripps News, which is a national TV network, as their national security correspondent, covering the wars in Ukraine and Israel, covering January 6th, the George Floyd protests, the collapse of Afghanistan. I interviewed a man who had been trying to get out his interpreters, and he took his own life as the Taliban was sweeping through the country. And the Marines in his battalion chose to take up his mission and try to rescue these interpreters. So I followed them on the journey. I went to my source's memorial service, and that was one example of a story that I did for them. Before that, I was with NPR as a breaking news reporter. And I also was with National Geographic and Smithsonian. Before that, I was at the U.S. State Department. In between, I was also doing some freelance work for the Washington Post, among other places, and ended up starting a nonprofit organization, recording the music of refugees, and went to Iraq, went to Bangladesh. And just about 6 months ago, I founded my own publication called HUMINT, which, as we know, stands for Human Intelligence.
Yes.
And the whole idea is to tell human stories that intersect with the intelligence community.
Which I am a subscriber of, and I will link in the show notes of this episode.
Thank you.
To Human. I totally hear that because, I kind of came across the intelligence world, but totally by happenstance. I was looking for a museum job, and the Spy Museum offered me the job. I had no knowledge of spies, no knowledge of anything apart from, I think I had seen The Imitation Game, one time, and I was like, that's a great movie. Benedict Cumberbatch is awesome in that movie. Never seen a James Bond movie. But I started learning so much about intelligence and spy stuff. And what really hit me was that this work, all of this history, is so deeply ingrained into the world. Every country, maybe not every country, spies. I don't know if I believe that totally, but it's so intelligence is everywhere, right? It's everywhere. It has been everywhere for thousands and thousands of years. It's so important to so many of the functions of government, to so many functions of everyday life, really. I mean, you and I spy all the time, too. I certainly do on, family members.
I also need to say I worked for the real State Department, not the fake State Department, which is what people in D.C. sometimes say.
Oh, yes.
As code for working at the CIA.
Yeah.
I worked at the real State
Department. Yeah.
And do I spy? I'm a journalist. I ask questions.
That could be considered spying sometimes, could be considered spying. But I've found it so interesting because it's something that is so critically important to our world today and to history, but it's something I certainly never learned about in school. I had a history degree in college. I never learned about it there either. So I can totally understand, the feeling of getting immersed into this world and then sort of getting a hunger to learn more and to explore more. Yeah. So I totally hear that.
Yeah.
And I almost feel, kind of the same way in that with Spycast too, we've been able to explore these stories, and I've had the opportunity to ask questions and explore more about what I'm interested in, which sounds a lot like, kind of your story.
Yeah, when you say that, it reminds me of what I felt when I was first on this team countering and debunking Russian disinformation. I almost felt like I was a character in a book, that I had just been implanted into this different existence, and it was really cool.
Right. And you're like, wait a second, let me go back a few chapters. So I feel like I must have missed a chapter here. There's so much information. So I've just loved sharing these stories through Spycast. And I've loved, working with Spy and sharing these stories across the world. But I want to know what makes you, what is important about this work to you? What do you think is the impact of sharing spy stories around the world?
Well, I think that it's an area where there's a lot of mystery.
Yeah.
And it's fun to delve into the mystery, but it's just as fun to demystify. And I find the truth more interesting than the fiction.
So do I.
Maybe that's why we're sitting in this room.
Right. Maybe that's why I've never seen a James Bond movie. I've seen two now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow. You're
Big
dropping
fan.
bombs here. Yeah, but there was a story that I did a few years ago that was groundbreaking.
Hmm.
The story was about the mental health struggles of people in the intelligence community. And while we know that veterans who serve are often traumatized, who have their own demons,
Hmm.
this is something that intelligence officers often don't talk about.
Right.
And it can be because the information is classified. It could be because they're fearful that they won't ascend in their intelligence agency. And I thought that it was an important area to explore.
Yeah.
And I ended up talking to the number two at the Defense Intelligence Agency, who was a former when we sat down together. I interviewed other former senior intel officers from the CIA and also the CIA's Chief of Medical Services.
Hmm.
And that was a really important report for me because it showed that they are humans who
Right.
struggle with the same struggles that everybody else has.
Yeah.
They bring it with them to work, they go home with it. How do they deal with it?
Mm-hmm.
The number two at the Defense Intel Agency told me about his struggle with alcohol
Mm-hmm.
and how when he walked into his office one day, they said to him, "We can smell this on your breath."
Mm.
And there was a lot of vulnerability in sharing that story.
Right.
And it mattered to me that they trusted me enough to share that. And then the CIA hired a chief of well-being officer,
Oh, wow. Really?
and the FBI, this incited conversations about how they should treat their own agents
Wow.
and analysts. And so it was important to me. It's
Mhm.
hard to measure impact
Right.
sometimes
It
when you're a
is.
journalist, but I felt like that was a really important story because it hadn't been done before.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, those are some concrete outcomes, really. And, I think that that is so important. And that's important for today's workforce. But also, I find that's humanizing people and humanizing, almost like these characters in our stories is so important throughout history, really, because we tend to see when we study history, or at least when I do, we tend to see these people just as characters in a book, or as these very static people that existed at one time and did a thing, and then well, we remember them as we remember them today. But it's so important to always remember those people as human beings who had feelings, who woke up in the morning and went to brush their teeth and realized that they were all out of toothpaste, and they're like, So they're just humans just like us. And I think when you start looking at history and when you start looking at stories like that, it becomes so much easier to connect with and so much easier to really understand just from a human level, and how that sort of impacts how that history has brought us to where we are today and where it's going to go in the future too.
Mm-hmm.
So that is, I love that because it's in a lot of ways the same way that I look at history and telling stories. What's really interesting too is, speaking of history, our past Spycast hosts have all been historians. You will be our first Spycast host who is not a historian, who is in fact a journalist. What does that difference mean to you? Or what, as a journalist, do you think you can bring that is different than a historian? We love our historians, but I'm so excited to start this journey with a journalist.
Well, it really is an honor to be chosen for this and to lead a new era for Spycast. As a person who has covered national security and intelligence for the past 5 years, I really bring a sense of what's happening in the modern day. And so I take that knowledge and I take those sources with me, as opposed to a historian who could probably contextualize in really rich detail.
Mm-hmm.
But we're heading into 2025, and there are a lot of major conflicts and issues. Of course, there's the war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
There's the war between Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah. We see what's happening with Iran.
Yeah.
And then the Syrian regime was toppled. There's the ongoing competition with China.
Mm.
And these are all very quickly moving situations that have real implications for Americans.
Yeah.
So providing clarity, finding stories, telling these stories to people in a way that makes them care is
Right.
part of what I want to do. I also want to spend time looking at the human aspect, the emotions that drive the decisions, that set the policies, that create the politics.
Right.
That is important to me. And so I'll bring that spirit of curiosity into Spycast.
Right. That's excellent. I mean, I think it's so important that we've always tried to keep an eye on the current. We've always tried to keep an eye on the past, present, and the future. But I think, moving into 2025, I think it's going to become increasingly important for people to understand what's going on around them. And I think as Spycast, we have an awesome opportunity to help people understand what's going on, and not necessarily to tell people that, hey, everything's going to be okay, but to give people the tools and the resources to be able to contextualize all of this and understand the day and time that we're living in, and what might happen next.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So as we move into 2025, we are starting a new era. I'm wondering what some of your goals are. So tell me about some of your key goals. What do you want to do with this new era?
Well, hopefully I won't make people angry at the museum for doing the questions that journalists tend
questions
to annoy people with.
Yeah. So far, so good.
Check. I do want to continue the legacy of Spycast, of telling these compelling stories about covert action and espionage. I want to spend time dwelling in the contemporary, and then when we revisit the past and find new things, which we will,
Yes,
we're going to talk about why it's relevant to today. I want people to understand why the decisions that happen in Washington or Moscow or Beijing, all of these different places, why those decisions are made and how it affects them, so that they want to continue learning.
Right.
I want it to be a place where somebody who is just dipping their toes into the spy world is as welcome as a person who has spent a lot of time in this world.
Right.
And I want to make sure that we are featuring different voices, people who come from different ideological backgrounds, different nationalities, different ethnicities, gender, race. I think that the perspectives will provide a richness in understanding the intelligence community. And I also think that if a person can't come to Washington and step into the museum for whatever reason, not enough time, don't have the money right now, that Spycast is a place where they can be a part of the community, where they can join us and they can learn and they can experience and they can feel.
Yeah. I mean, I think about that all the time because, I come from a small town outside of Cleveland, Ohio, and a lot of times, feels like decisions made in, like you were saying, decisions made in D.C. and London and Beijing, they don't reach us in Twinsburg, Ohio, but they so do. So, I am grateful for the opportunity to, be a small part of sharing these stories with my family and friends back in Ohio, who I know do listen, and have that opportunity to connect with the Spy Museum 200 miles away every week. So it's such an amazing opportunity. I'm so thankful that we have you here. I'm so thankful for the opportunity to work with you. It's been great. And I can't wait to see what comes next.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I've just so much enjoyed spending time with you in this studio, all of the messages, and you coming and getting me at the elevator when the elevator doesn't work.
Yes.
But no, I feel really grateful for the team that we've assembled. I know that we're going to have a lot of fun and share things that people don't know anything about.
Yes. Our next episode will be navigating the elevator system at the International Spy Museum.
It's its own maze.
Yes,
it is literally harder to get into the museum than it is to get into the White House, for the record.
I believe that. I really do. Well,
At least in my experience.
Well, thank you so much, Sasha. It's been great.
Thanks so much, Erin.